Here are 46 doubts you may have on Christianity. Number 1, incoherence of all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good deities. This is a classic paradox of omnipotence where how can we question an all-powerful being creating a task it cannot perform, like lifting a stone so heavy it cannot lift it? So we have answers to this question that say God can't do anything out of his own nature, for example, is a classic explanation or answer to this. But this says, well, then, hey, you have it in the writing. There's something God can't do, something that's out of his nature. Why can't he do that thing out of his nature? And then this will go into a back and forth argument. You have to consider then the reason this argument emerges maybe isn't because of all of the challenges that come with defending God's position here. Maybe it is the fact that something all-powerful, something all-knowing is already inconceivable, is not logically consistent. And so this could be doubt not for the higher potential that God exists, but maybe that this is a sort of human invention that lays within it contradictions. Number 2, the problem of evil. This is a huge one. Unnecessary suffering contradicts this idea of a benevolent, omnipresent, omnipotent God, right? If natural disasters, for example, and diseases constantly going throughout our world challenges the idea of some all-powerful yet all-loving deity. Why would we see things like leukemia in children who have done nothing wrong come into this world? And this again has to create some sort of disgusting rebuttals that excuse the behavior. It's because we're all sinful by nature. We've inherited this sin from Adam, is what a large sect of Christians may say. Another reason is that we've created this sin ourselves. More or less the same answer. But never will they say that God has caused this. But yet God is all-powerful. We're in another contradiction. Number 3, the problem of divine hiddenness. If God desires a relationship with us, humans, his apparent absence or silence is puzzling. And I full-heartedly agree with this. I sincerely would love a relationship with Jesus. I say that with all of my heart, if there is such something I can have. But it seems perplexing to me that as much as I want this, as I'd want this grace, I'd want this divine revelation, I'd want this more fulfilling thing that we have in our own universe, if it's there, why doesn't he come and show himself? Number 4, the logical inconsistencies within the concept of the Trinity. Obviously, the Trinity doctrine itself posits that God is simultaneously 3 distinct persons, but one being, which is a bit of a logical contradiction. How can you be both the Father and the Son at the same time? And again, similar to the omnipotence paradox or the problem of evil, this is an answer that Christians may give that, well, it's, of course we won't logically understand it because it's God, right? God kind of exists outside of how we can understand him logically. The Trinity is a mystery, one of God's mysteries. And so when all of the answers you can give are only, we can't understand them because they're mysteries, it leads me to wonder, well, maybe the thing we're trying to understand might not be real in the first place. Number 5, the absurdity of infinite punishment for finite sins. This is another big one. We are, in Christian doctrine, most schools of thought, all damned to hell for the sins we commit. And we rely on the sacrifice of Jesus to atone for those sins. And so if we do not accept Jesus, if we die rejecting Jesus or living a poor life, whatever your particular flavor of Christianity preaches, we must go to hell. We do not get to be with Jesus in heaven, but we have infinite, hell is forever, infinite punishment. But we lived a finite life, right? Maybe you only lived for 20 years and you lived an innocuous life, but you just didn't believe in God's existence because of, his hiddenness, among other things. This is infinite punishment for us. And so that's a big contradiction in my brain. Why would you be punished forever for a finite amount of things that you've done? Number 6, the lack of contemporary historical evidence for Jesus' life and miracles. No contemporaneous Roman records corroborate the gospel accounts of Jesus' life or miracles. You can look at a lot of scholars that have much more research and knowledge on these subjects than I do, but all of the stories and histories that talk about Jesus' life are only corroborated with the other Gospels in the Bible. We don't have these other third-party Roman accounts from the time talking about Jesus' life and his miracles. And if, again, this was such an important person making all of these huge things happen, healing people, right, curing people, bringing people from the dead, why wouldn't other third-party sources be talking about it? And there are no credible non-Christian sources to confirm the resurrection. Number 7, historical references to Jesus outside the Bible are sparse and often written decades later, right? Things talking about the resurrection at the time of the resurrection are non-existent. Number 8, there's contradictions in the gospel narratives themselves. There's a really great website, I'll link, that tests you on your knowledge of the story in the gospel. And you can be wrong and right in so many different ways because the 4 Gospels themselves tell the story differently. Discrepancies exist in accounts of events like the resurrection, where different Gospels report variables differently, details differently, how many people were at the tomb, the level of detail of the tomb, what they did after they saw Jesus, who saw Jesus. All of these things change depending on where you look in the Gospels. So if it's some divinely revealed, all-important single truth, you'd think you'd have many accounts from many different perspectives saying the same thing, but we have few accounts from a limited amount of perspectives saying different things. Number 9, late authorship and anonymous origins of the Gospels. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death and were initially circulated anonymously. We didn't get names like the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke and John until many, many decades after, right? The church fathers even talked about the Gospels that we have on records, but they didn't even say that this is the Gospel of so-and-so. So it's more than likely that these were not written by the people that they say they're written about, like i.e. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so there's a level of anonymity there, right? It could just be an invention from multiple people writing them together, a corroboration to create this theological event after the fact. It's really, really ambiguous. And then that leads me to the next point, number 10, which is a reliance on oral tradition decades after events supposedly occurred, right? The stories of Jesus were apparently transmitted orally for years, for decades, before being documented. So this increases the potential for alterations so much. And I hear often the case that, well, back in those days, most people didn't know how to write. So they had an oral tradition. They must have had an oral tradition. And people back then, they just remembered things by story, orally, so much better than we do today. I don't think that's the case. Humans always had miscommunications. That's why we see different dialects throughout all time, right? We don't say things exactly perfectly verbatim the same way over and over. That's why legends exist of so many different stories. Where I live in Japan, there's a story of Momotaro, this boy born from a peach who goes to kill a demon. But depending on the variant of you hear of that story, where you're in Japan, if you're in Tokyo versus Osaka versus Okinawa, you get different details of that story, right? Because the oral tradition changes over time. And so there were decades of time between the supposed death and resurrection of Jesus and the first gospel accounts being written. So as Bart Ehrman says, all of that time is free reign for the legend of Jesus to have been created, not a perfect oral record to be transmitted. Number 11, I would say, would be the absence of reliable historical evidence for many biblical events, such as Exodus. So outside of just the New Testament and the Gospels, there's many archaeological findings that have not been substantiated, not substantiating key events like Exodus as described in the Bible. We do have things like, yes, the Bible refers to this real, physical, geographical place, this historical place, but the entire book of Exodus, looking at the Jews leaving Egypt, going on this pilgrimage, is all an invention as far as we know from the archaeological evidence. Number 12, let's talk about the incompatibility of Genesis with modern cosmology. And you have to spin how you understand the origin story of the Bible to fit a modern understanding of the universe itself. The creation account conflicts with, for example, the Big Bang Theory. God created the earth in 7 days. Sorry, I don't remember. 7 days, right? The age of the universe is around 14 billion years old, and I think Earth is what, like 9 billion years old, and so the process of going from creation of universe to Earth and life is not something that occurs in 6 7 days. And even if you take day doesn't mean literal day. Day maybe means eons. Well, is that what the original, Greek or the original language is saying, or is that just how we're interpreting it now, or is it, the way they wrote it then, it was more metaphorical? Is that what you're trying to say? Then look at the order of events in creation, right? Does that line up? Were there a bunch of matters of elements and stars and mass, and then hydrogen, and then leading to those hydrogen atoms kind of bonding together, and then coming together to create stars and black holes and all of this cosmological stuff before we even have this idea of planets. And no, that there's not anything written like that in the creation account of Genesis, right? So it does not line up with the actual way the universe came into existence. Number 13, the rejection of evolution by Christianity, or at least most of Christianity. We get a strange distinction. I recall growing up in a Protestant background where we say, well, we agree microevolution. We agree that traits can change over time. No one's denying that. What we're saying is, monkeys can't change into humans. Macroevolution. Actual scientists don't make such a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, because we understand that, because scientists understand that, well, a change in trait can be enough over enough generations for a change in species. And this is something that I think many Christians seem to gloss over, who are, young earth creationists, for example, or reject evolution, is that no one ever says a particular species turns into another particular species. Evolution refers to generations upon generations of species having mutations which lead to new species. And you might think, well, humans and monkeys are so far apart, right? How could humans have... We actually have only a 2% difference in DNA. Only a 2% difference in DNA. And actually most life is, as I understand it, very similar in DNA structure. Especially if you look at, say, all mammals, for example, right? And then most humans are actually, I believe, like only 0.01% different in DNA. So if you look at me, and you compare me with some huge Nordic guy and some, tiny Filipino grandma, or some, big Kenyan dude, right? And look how different these humans all look. We all have actually 99.99% the same DNA. We're a lot closer than it might seem based off of your common sense. And this all points to the fact that we share common ancestors and that we evolve generationally. And the fact that the universe is billions of years old, right? And the Earth, too, is, as I understand it, billions of years old. And life has had millions and millions of years to evolve. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of changes. Enough so that you can have this cornucopia of life on our Earth. So why reject this, despite the evidence showing that this is how we come about? Why? Number 14, I would talk about the scientific implausibility of many Bible stories, like Noah's Ark. Logistical challenges make the literal interpretation of Noah's Ark untenable, right? You can't, two of every kind bringing onto an ark. Two of every kind of what? If you have two of every kind of the species a couple thousand years ago, you would not be able to fit that into an ark, right? If we're talking about species, let's go to what we were just talking about, species, two different kinds of animal that can reproduce and have offspring. Okay, if you bring all species, that will not fit into an ark. You have to think about birds, right? If you think you have two birds and you bring that in an ark, that's enough. No. all the birds are a species of bird, but maybe you have like, robins, and you have hawks, and you have I'm forgetting pigeons. You have all these different species of birds, and you can have like so and so tailed pigeon versus so and so tailed pigeon. Those are different species. They can't mate with one another. You need those. It is nonsensical. It is nonsensical, and so you have to get strange explanations. Strange explanations. Well, you just think of the major ones. Like you bring two birds. You don't have to bring all these other random species. It'll just repopulate after that. And then you bring two snakes. You don't have to bring all the weird different types of snakes. Just two snakes. That's good. And so you can fit that. Fit all the important ones on a boat. You could imagine. I've heard it before where it's like there's so many species of a specific type of bug, right? That the biomass would be hundreds of arcs full, right? So you have to make some arbitrary distinction. And these two represent animals enough so that you can just bring these two, and then they'll repopulate and reaffirm after. But then the Bible story apparently is only like 5 to 10,000 years ago, right? So you have to come up with some explanation where it's like, okay, everything on Earth was destroyed by a huge flood, but then all of these animals on the ark came out and repopulated, and then maybe you have to like coax some sort of creationist evolutionist theory where it's like, well, then the geographical and the physical laws were different at the time. So even though today we have millions of species of snakes, at the time there's only a snake pair on the Noah Ark, so it came out. But then the Earth was different then, so it had to repopulate a lot quicker and create all these different species somehow. Is the hoops that you have to jump through to say that Noah's Ark actually happened? So if you think that Noah's Ark is an actual historical event, you are saying something really absurd. The next interpretation you have to take then is that, well, maybe Noah's Ark didn't happen literally. Maybe it's a symbolic story. Maybe the Bible is talking in these kind of parable. It's not a parable. Maybe it's like hyperbole, etc., etc. This is just another chip in the armor for your faith, right? How can you be sure that this is true? Next, number 15, I would say the denial of human common ancestry with other animals. We just talked about this, but again, despite genetic evidence, a lot of Christians will reject the idea that humans share common ancestors with other species. This goes against Christianity directly. Yes, you can marry the two. You can say, well, God used evolution to create humans. But it says in his image, does it not? We were created in God's image. We are specially created in God's image. So if you understand that, well, actually, we have a theory of how life came about, like lightning zapping the ocean, all of these chemicals, and we have these prokaryotic cells coming out, and abiogenesis, where we get the first sort of single-celled life, and that chills for millions of years, and that starts to become, forms into multi-celled life, and we get all this stuff, and this forms out. We have this beautiful theory of how life comes about, the origin of species, and that does not bring any sort of evidence that we are special. We are just another branch on the huge tree of life. So you have to deny human common ancestry if you want to think that we are created in God's special image. But that's not what the evidence shows us. So this is another reason to doubt your faith in Christianity. Number 16, the age of the earth conflicts with biblical chronology. Well, I suppose this goes inconsistently with the previous points in that we observe the earth to be so old, right? About 4.5 billion years old. But the biblical timeline is the earth is 6,000 years old, 10,000 years old, something like that, right? It does not square. You can just look at layers of sediment in the ground, looking at geological, like layers on a cake of how the earth has to be hundreds of millions, billions of years old. You look at the fossil record and it lines up with this fact, the age of the earth. You have to deny everything. You have to deny carbon dating. You have to deny, the geological evidence. You have to deny the ecological evidence. You have to deny all of these things because Christianity says so. Number 17, and we're moving on to a bit of a different one, but I would say prayer has also not been shown efficacy in controlled studies. We do have people running tests where, groups praying versus not praying over people, and for example, in health outcomes, and it doesn't show that there's any specific outcome there, right? Maybe you'll say you should not test, the Lord your God, but prayer does not seem to do anything. Maybe it has a personal sense of fulfillment, right? But that could be attained in a similar way to, say, meditation or deep breathing exercises, if you compare it to people of other faiths or irreligious people. So because prayer doesn't actually affect anything, I think it's a good reason to doubt Christianity. Number 18, the Bible endorses slavery. So I think this contradicts the idea of an omnibenevolent God, but there's many passages in Scripture which contain the regulation and, by implication, the condoning of slavery all over the Old Testament, about how, you take over a land and you can make people into your slaves, into your property. It's okay. Biblical slavery is okay. Number 19, we have genocide commanded by God in the Old Testament. And I'm sure this is a big topic that continues to come up because it's important. Accounts like the conquest of Canaan, right, involve divinely sanctioned mass killings. And so we hear often from the theists the idea of, objective morality and then divine command. So what's weird is that, and I'm going to go on a tangent real quick, but you can have your own ethical framework of how you view and observe the world, and everybody does. And a Christian theist would argue that your feelings are really just, your opinions. They're not real if you don't have God, because with God you have objective morality. Yet it is that God of the Bible which says, "Thou shalt not kill," at the same time commands killing, and it's okay. But it works out because if it's divinely commanded, then it supersedes these, sort of secondary commandments we have. Who was it that then has the more objective morality then? Is it someone like the rule utilitarian like myself who said, I would never think it's okay to kill? I never think it's okay to kill. Of course, I will draw some exceptions, right? If you're being attacked and you're defending yourself, okay. But I will say more consistently than God that genocide is bad. And yet the Bible comes up with reasons for genocide to be good. Number 20, I would talk about misogyny in biblical texts, such as the subjugation of women. Certain passages talking about subordinate roles for women in society and in church, giving roles specifically to how women ought to behave and ought to work. And if we're not at the same level to talk about this, then you might just disregard and say, well, women ought to be put in these roles, in which case we have a lot more discussions to be had. But the point is, if you think that women and men should be treated as equal humans, right? Women and men should be treated equally well, then putting people into a box because of their gender works against that. And especially if you're talking about some sort of truth in religion and in philosophy in the world, why should women not be able to participate in that? Or why should women be subordinate to men? I don't think it squares with an idea of an all-loving God. Number 21, the endorsement of capital punishment for minor offenses. This is another big one, something that, again, you would call a religious extremist today, or an insane person, where, for example, killing people for working on the Sabbath, or there was a prophet in the Old Testament who was insulted for being bald, and so God sent bears to kill children who did that, and that was okay. So the level of biblical justice is not sensical, right? You have one infraction, penalty, death. Whereas if you were to do that today, you would be locked away. You would be called an extremist, a terrorist, and they would be looking for your manifesto online, wherever you happen to put it up. But this is, again, the way of the Christian God. Number 22, eternal damnation as moral blackmail. The concept of hell can be viewed as coercive, right? Compelling belief under threat of punishment. And I do remember when I did deconvert from Christianity when I was 13, This was the last thread I had holding my, I suppose, fabric of Christianity together. And I realized it is intentional. It is a tactic of fear to control people into being religious. The fear of hell is terrifying when you believe it's real, because it is eternal damnation and torment, right? And so people say often, quite conceitedly, I might add, well, God doesn't force you to believe in him. That's why we have free will. That's why he maybe is hidden. That's why you have to work to find him. You can come to him if you want. Time out. If I knew that divine punishment for eternity is the alternative, is it really a free choice to come to him? It's as free as being pointed to by a gun at your head saying, give me your money. Or don't. It's your choice. Number 23, religious justification for colonialism and conquest. This is a historical reason, but Christianity was used to legitimize the subjugation and exploitation of indigenous peoples in the U.S., in the African continent, in many, many different ways and places. Christianity was used as, you're proselytizing. No, you're teaching the gospel. You're bringing them up to society. It's been used as a shoehorn to say that this society has better values than this society, and so you're justified in subjugating them. Now, maybe today at present, we don't have a country literally invading a new land and using their religion as a backdrop to fill. Oh, wait, no, you do. If you look at Russia invading Ukraine, they're using, what are they using as an example to justify it? Yes, they are using this idea that Russians have a native land in the Ukraine. There's actually Russians in Ukraine. They want to be part of Russia. This part was taken unjustly by Ukraine. But if you look at how Russia is using the Orthodox Church, it is using religion to justify conquest. Even today, yes. If you look at the violent conflicts against Palestinians from Israel, they are using their religion to justify taking over their land. Of course, the first pretext is, well, they're terrorists, right? They're a Gaza terrorist. For Ukraine and Russia, their first pretext is, no, there are Russians here already. They're native Russians here already. They want to be part of Russia. But then a big supporting reason is that they're using their religion. They're using this Orthodox Christianity. The Israel army is using this, which Christians might agree with. This holy land. This is our holy land, and so we have this right to take it away. So all of these things are using religion, using Christianity in this case, to terribly subjugate people. Historically, it has been done, and it is still being done today. Historical opposition to science and progress would be another reason, 24. So figures like, of course, Galileo being persecuted for scientific views that contradicted church teachings is a big one, right? If you have an idea that goes against the church, goes against Christianity, you will be persecuted for that. Even in more recent, say, American history, right, teaching natural selection is something that is being frowned against and stopped in schools, where they want to teach many schools of thought for the origin of life, right? You want to teach divine, what was it, creationism as well, right? Creationism alongside. So you're using Christianity to fudge in wrong teachings, to fudge out the correct teachings. Number 25, I would say the church's historical suppression of alternative Christianities is also a good indication to doubt the sincerity of the religion as a whole. If you were to have, say, for example, in the body of science, that we have many different groups coming to support and argue and try and disprove certain ideas and eventually come to a consensus or multiple consensuses, then you would understand how it points to some idea of truth. Yet early church authorities, for example, with the Arianist heresies, as it was called, or Gnostic heresies, were these alternate ideas to understanding Christianity were divergent and called heretical, where they were suppressed or ultimately thrown out. And if you think about it, they're not thrown out because they're more or less true. If that's the case, and it's strange that we still see splintering and more sects being built hundreds of years later, with Oriental Schism, the East-West Schism, the Protestant Reformation, the splintering of all of the different schools of thought within Protestant denominations, and of course, even within the other main churches, you have disagreements and splinterings and suppressions and alternate pushings off of Catholic and Orthodox churches, right? And so this is not something that's indicative of a body that backs an idea of truth. This is not something indicative of something that's trying to be agreed on as truth. This is indicative of a created sense of beliefs and a culture behind it, a body behind it that is having politically motivated or theologically motivated, splinterings. It doesn't make sense that some idea of truth can't be agreed upon by the body backing it up. Number 26, the condemnation of gay people, queer people, LGBT people, right? Certain biblical passages have been interpreted by the majority of Christians to denounce same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships, romantic same-sex attraction, queer gender identities as well, and trans people, of course, are all considered sinful. And this is one of the biggest hurdles for me. If I could spend the most time on where I find the biggest struggle with Christianity, yes, it is with the scientific evidence I brought up. Yes, it is with the things I'm going to continue talking about. It's about the illogical contradictions within it. It's about the suppositions of it from a philosophical perspective. But this one really just bites at me because I sincerely do not believe that if there was such thing as an all-loving God, that they would be opposed to people loving just because they're of the same gender, just because they're not sure of their gender identity. So that's something I could never wrap my head around, unfortunately. If you want me to become Christian, and I want to become Christian too, again, if Jesus is real, if God is real, if there is such a thing as an afterlife in heaven, if there is this a wonderful relationship to have with Jesus, I want it. I sincerely do. But I just can't wrap my head around it. And this is a huge one for me. What I've heard is, well, no. Christians say don't hate gay people. We love gay people. We just take them as they are. We still support them. We still love them. Love the sinner, not the sin. But you're saying it's wrong for them to act on that. It's not wrong for me to love a woman, to be in love with a woman, to be married to a woman. Yet it's wrong for a gay person to love another man. Why? Sure, you're saying love the sinner, hate the sin, but why should this be a sin? Why? Now, this has gone on quite a while, so the remainder of the points I'm going to be putting in a part 2, so please look forward to that. Thank you guys. Please like, comment, and subscribe.